All right. Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you all for joining our LinkedIn Live today for the October edition of our Charting the Course monthly Q&A series, where we interview partners and investors in our network who are charting the course to create impact, manage long-term risk, and strive for a more just and humane world. I'm Fanta, Director of Business and Human Rights at RFK Human Rights, where my team convenes, educates, and mobilizes investors to address inequality as a systemic risk, all to build a more just, inclusive, and equitable economy and society for the future. 2 days ago, we honored our founder, Mrs. Ethel Kennedy, at her celebration of life in DC. Among her many passions included her lifelong dedication to worker rights and her constant finding of a way to march with unmockly workers decade after decade. We carry on her legacy in our commitment to worker rights, our work engaging investors around workplace dignity, and by supporting organizations such as One Fair Wage. One Fair Wage works to end the subminimum wage and ensure all workers are paid at least a full fair minimum wage from their employers. Today, I'm here with the president of One Fair Wage, Saru Jayaraman. Alongside her role at One Fair Wage, she's a director of Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley, and previously founded the Restaurant Opportunity Center, which brought together restaurant workers, employers, and consumers. Saru, it's always great seeing you and connecting with you, and it's a pleasure to speak with you today, especially off the heels of your success in Michigan. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So there's so much to discuss, as always, Saru, and we have a limited amount of time, so let's just jump in. You began One Fair Wage in 2019. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to start the organization and how the issue of One Fair Wage connects to racial and gender justice?
Absolutely. So started this work much earlier than that, 2002. As you know, we started the Restaurant Opportunity Center following 9/11. So on 9/11, there was a restaurant at the top of the World Trade Center, Tower 1. On that morning, 73 workers died in the restaurant. 13,000 workers lost their jobs in the months and weeks following the tragedy. And I was asked to start a relief center, which we called ROC, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, for restaurant workers who lost their jobs in New York. But we used that opportunity to ask workers in New York and then all over the country, what are your top needs and concerns? And everywhere we went, workers would say, it's my wages, it's my wages, it's my wages. And when we did the research to find out why they kept talking about their wages, it became clear. The restaurant industry has been the largest and fastest growing private sector employer of youth, women, people of color, immigrants, pretty much every group. But it's been the absolute lowest paying employer for generations due to a horrific legacy of slavery. Prior to emancipation, waiters in the US were mostly white men who got no tips, only wages, and went on strike in 1853 for higher wages. And the restaurant industry started looking for cheaper labor. After emancipation, they found it with new Black workers coming up from the South that they would hire and tell, you're not going to get a wage at all. You're going to get this new thing that you're only going to live on, this new thing that's come from Europe called a tip. Now in Europe, tipping had been used as an extra or bonus on top of a wage. But in the United States, we uniquely mutated tipping, the only country on earth that's done this, to become a replacement for wages, the entirety of a worker's wage, in order to allow restaurants to access free Black labor after slavery had ended. And we went from a $0 wage in 1865 all the way up to $2.13 an hour in 2024. So that's almost 150 years of a wage that is ridiculous, hasn't gone up very much at all. And from that day until today, it's still overwhelmingly women who deal with the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because they have to put up with so much from customers to get tips, highest rates of wage theft of any industry because it's a complicated system that requires employers to count, make sure tips are bringing workers to the full minimum wage, and highest rates of racial inequity also because, unfortunately, the data shows tipping is biased. Consumers have something called implicit bias, and it results in a Black woman earning always $5 to $8 per hour less in tips than a white man, just as an example, because they have to rely on the biases and harassment of customer to feed their families in tips. So that's why we started the organization, is to focus on this issue, this absurd history and this issue to get rid of that sub-minimum wage for tipped workers in the U.S.
That's great and super important to have that context and then that history as to why you founded this work, right? And you mentioned, Europe, and how, the US mutated tipping from Europe. So to this idea of, looking at this issue globally, right? Wage inequality is an issue that we do see globally. Do you see any parallels between the One Fair Wage movement in the US and similar movements globally? And how can we build global solidarity for wage justice?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, this is a global issue. This whole idea of tipping started in Europe as an extra bonus on top of a wage, came to the States and was used by employers post-emancipation as a replacement for wages. But around that same time that happened, actually, there was an anti-tipping movement in the US that grew and spread to Europe, and labor unions picked it up in Europe and got rid of tipping in much of Europe in the early 1900s, saying, we're professionals. We don't live on your largesse. We deserve to be paid a livable wage by our employers. And that's why when you travel to Europe, tipping isn't as prevalent. People get a livable wage. So absolutely, it's not just Europe and America. People have been fighting for wage equity all over the world. And I think in particular, part of the story we're telling here is that it's both about wage equity and fair wages and livable wages. It's also about certain populations being cut out or excluded from the protections that everybody else gets because of race or gender or other identity-based discrimination. And that is universal. We are seeing lots of countries where workers are denied certain rights or have lesser wages based on race or gender. I mean, that's pretty universal, and why I think the issue resonates so globally. We did a couple of years ago try to pull together restaurant workers from all over the world on these issues. And that is it's tough to do with limited resources, but so important because, as you say, everybody is dealing with these issues everywhere.
Exactly. And Saru, one of the reasons why we love working with you and your organization is just listening to the stories that you're able to tell, right? The stories from both on the ground here in the US and also globally. And, we love to elevate those stories, but also elevate the success stories of your organization as well, right? And, 2023 and 2024 were successful years for the One Fair Wage movement, including successful legislative campaigns in the city of Chicago and most recently in Michigan. So what lessons do you take from these successes, and what campaigns are front of mind right now? And then to add to that, after a city or a state adopts One Fair Wage policies, what are the most crucial next steps to ensure the sustainability and enforcement of these policies?
Yeah. So we are going through a moment of pretty dramatic transformation in the restaurant industry. All across the country, post-pandemic, workers in this industry started saying, enough is enough. I can't put up with it anymore. I mean, let's remember what happened with the pandemic, how traumatic it was for everybody, and in particular for these workers. So on Friday the 13th, 2020, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 2/3 of those workers told us that they couldn't get unemployment insurance because they were told in most states that their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. They went back to work before it was safe. In fact, the Center for Disease Control and UC San Francisco both named restaurants the most dangerous place to work above hospitals during the pandemic. 12,000 workers died. In my opinion, 12,000 workers were murdered because we told them as a country, you don't get benefits because you are not paid enough. And why they weren't paid enough is our fault to begin with.
Right.
Not their fault. And so they went back to work before it was safe. 12,000 workers died. And millions of workers experienced and told us that they experienced tips going way down because sales were down, and harassment, which was already the highest in our industry of any industry, going way up, with thousands of women telling us, I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you.
Wow.
So a lot of people at that point at which they were confronted with my health versus the pay that I get at this job, said, you don't pay me enough to put up with the kinds of things that I put up with. And 1.2 million workers walked off the job saying, I won't come back unless I get a livable wage with tips on top. And in fact, they started to win it. We tracked thousands of restaurants across the country that voluntarily raised wages to a full minimum wage with tips on top because they couldn't find people willing to work for those wages. And that's the point at which we decided this is our moment to go really big. We have to stretch ourselves. We're doing something we call 25 by 250, trying to move bills and ballot measures in 25 states half the country by coming as we enter the United States 250th anniversary in 2026 and go into our next quarter millennium. Let's shed these legacies of slavery. And so we are working in dozens of states now to get this done. But that's what led us to start winning. We won in DC November 22, a 300% wage increase for tipped workers. We won, as you mentioned, in October 2023 in Chicago, 50% wage increase for 100,000 workers. And then our biggest victory to date, the state of Michigan, 1.2 million workers are getting a raise. Several 100,000 tipped workers are getting a raise from $3.87 to 15 plus tips. That's a 100% wage increase. It's really dramatic and so pivotal because Michigan has now become the first state east of the Mississippi to end that minimum wage for tipped workers, with many states to follow. We're on the ballot this November in Massachusetts. We've got legislation moving in New York and Connecticut and Maryland and Illinois following the Chicago victory. Things are moving across the country, and it's really exciting to see workers stand up for themselves and demand change.
It is, and it's also amazing to see what the ripple effects of having access to fair wages, right? And to be able to see that is just amazing, and it's great to continue to see the work that you're doing across these states, and hopefully we see this, happen, even more across other states, and hopefully other states will follow. Saru, one thing that I often, say is that your work is truly impactful and driving meaningful change when it begins to face resistance, right? And the One Fair Wage movement has faced opposition from the business community. What are some challenges that you've encountered in advocating for these changes? And how do you see paying a fair wage impacting businesses in the long term? And are there any misconceptions about the financial viability of ensuring fair wages for workers?
Yeah. So let's be clear about why this has been a hard fight. I told the story of the history of this issue, and I said after emancipation, restaurants were trying to hire newly freed Black people, not pay them, and force them to live on on tips alone. And that was really the work of an entity that came together around that time in 1919 called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. It's led by the chain restaurants today, but it's been around for over 100 years, fighting to say we shouldn't have to pay our workers' wages. We should get away with you paying our workers' wages. You, the customer, should pay our workers' wages. And they, I think, have a sense of entitlement that they've been able to do this for 100 years. How dare you, Saru, you, One Fair Wage, tell us that we have to do it differently? And so they've put up a very, very tough and in some cases violent opposition. In my case, with our members, they have intimidated and suppressed the voices of workers who are trying to speak up. In my case, they actually doxed me and sent people to our house in the middle of the night and sent us death threats. I had to move my family out of my house this year because it got that intense. But it's that kind of bullying behavior that I think they believe they can use to try to stop workers from speaking up for themselves. And it's only emboldened us further to say, this has to be done, and it has to be done now. And so that kind of attack on workers is scary. It's intimidating, but it hasn't stopped us. It's made our movement grow in many cases because people are outraged to see workers treated in that way. So I think that there is a lot of pushback, but the truth is on our side. To answer your question, 7 states have done this for a very long time. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska all require a full minimum wage with tips on top. These 7 states have had higher restaurant sales per capita, higher small business growth rates in the restaurant industry, higher overall restaurant industry job growth rates in the industry, higher tipping averages in the industry. I highlight that because the Restaurant Association loves to tell workers that their tips are going to go away if their wages go up. But in fact, tipping is the same or higher in the states that have already done this. Those 7 states also have 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry, because when you're a woman who's able to tell a customer, you know what, I get tips, but I don't need your tips, buzz off, you can stand up and reject harassment rather than having to tolerate it to get the tips. So in all of these ways, the 7 states that have done this for decades are much more successful than the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And I want to say you don't even have to take it from me. In 2021, the CFO, the chief financial officer of Denny's, told shareholders in an analyst call, $15 is going to be okay because Denny's California outperforms the system. He said Denny's California grows faster than any state, Denny's in any state in the United States, because we pay our people $15 an hour plus tips. They're able to bring their families to eat at Denny's, and so guest receipts are higher. We grow faster. He admitted that paying people a livable wage allows them to eat out at restaurants, bring their families to eat at restaurants. The other thing people don't realize is that it cuts down turnover dramatically in an industry that has the highest rates of employee turnover of any industry, because workers are constantly searching for new opportunities to do better, to feed themselves and do better. So I think that the states that have done this prove that not only can it be done, but it's actually better for workers, employers, and consumers when it's done.
Yes, I remember that vividly in 2021, working with your team and some partners on that, and literally hearing the CFO say, right, that actually is better for business and it's better for workers, right? And that's a clear example of, you know, having to elevate, right, those data points and those stories, right, even in the face of backlash, right? It's like really important to be able to elevate. This is what happens when we do right by our workers, right? And that's just continuing to elevate that. Something that we're seeing, you know, as we across RFK Human Rights are tackling issues such as worker rights, we're looking at the intersection of worker rights with some other core issues, right, such as climate change. And also we're seeing, you know, AI and like what AI may do for workers. So, you know, in your work fighting for one fair wage, Saru, how do you see these issues such as climate and, you know, AI intersecting with restaurants and other service workers and their impact on working conditions?
Yeah, I see all of these issues you're talking about as both challenges and real opportunities. So let's take climate. Look, climate affects these workers, my workers I represent, tipped workers, almost more than anybody else. You know, as tipped workers who rely exclusively on tips, customers to give them tips to feed their kids. Let's keep in mind that tipped workers have the highest rate of single moms of any occupation in the United States. So they're so completely reliant on those tips to feed their kids as single mothers. If there's a hurricane, if there's a blizzard, if it's a particularly hot day or a particularly cold day, people aren't going to come and eat out. And so you get paid that $2.13 an hour with no tips, and it's impossible to survive. It's like you're working for free. Not, you know, you're waiting there for people to show up. They don't show up. You don't get the tips. And, you know, your taxes eat up your wages, and that's it. You have nothing. So these workers are heavily impacted by climate change and have told us, if I had the capacity, I would engage on climate change. What is the problem? These workers are working 2 and 3 jobs, because when you're earning $2 an hour, even with tips, it's not at all enough to make ends meet. And so you have to work multiple jobs pretty much around the clock to pay the bills, to feed your family. So you have zero opportunity to engage. Voting is, you know, one thing, but engaging politically, you know, to show up and say, I demand change on climate, it's impossible. So the opportunity of delivering wage increases for people is that people might be able to work 1 job instead of 3. That means not only will they be able to spend time with their children, ensure their children are getting a quality education, but also they might actually be able to engage politically on things like climate and reproductive rights and all the other things that we care deeply about. So it's both a challenge and a real opportunity for us to get a huge workforce, 14 million people, the time and capacity and skill and ability to engage on things we need to change, like climate, addressing climate change. On tech and AI, similarly, real challenges. You know, post-pandemic, we're seeing an increasing use of the ordering pads, not just in restaurants, but across a number of sectors. And that has introduced tipping into sectors that never had it before. And new employers in retail environments are trying to get away with the same horrific exemption that the restaurant industry has had forever, of trying to reduce their workers' wages down to a sub-minimum wage because they get tips. I mean, we've seen some employers that you'd be ice cream shops saying, we're going to pay that sub-minimum wage and let workers get to a full minimum wage with tips. We saw an airline try to do this. We saw coffee shops try to do this. So as long as we allow there to be a sub-minimum wage, especially with Apple Pay, you're going to see a spread of tipping across every environment, which we as consumers, we lose out. We then are being asked to tip in every single environment of our lives. And it's because we've allowed for this exemption of a sub-minimum wage. Now, tech and AI could be bad for workers in that way. It could be bad in the sense that maybe at some point employers might try to replace workers with tech and AI, although we haven't seen it yet in the industry in real scale. You know, it could be bad, but it could also be good. There's ways in which tech and AI could be used to improve workers' experiences on the job, their ability to, you know, create great meals and come up with new drinks and provide better service. So I think in both cases, if we are really centering workers and their lives and their humanity and their experiences, there's ways in which we can see these coming changes, climate change, tech and AI, and other changes as positive. Again, if we are centering people, as humans, and understanding they have needs and desires and deserve to be paid and treated as the professionals that they are.
And that's key. And I think you said it best. It's all about how do we center these workers, right? As we're thinking about, you know, both the challenges and the opportunities that come from, you know, these core issues. And I think that's important. Looking to the future, Saru, 2026 marks the 250th anniversary of the founding of the U.S. and an opportunity to commit to shared values, including dignity-centered work. Labor has long been thought of as an expense to the U.S., in the U.S. rather than our most powerful investment. How do we shift that narrative?
Yeah. How do we shift the narrative that it's too costly for us to invest in workers, and instead we must, to a narrative that understands that investing in workers is actually in all of our best interests? Did I get that right?
Yes. Yes.
You know, one of the bad things about this current system that we have for publicly traded corporations is that they look at returns, investor returns, over a quarter, just a quarter, so 3 months. And if you're only looking in 3-month intervals, you might see the investment in workers raising their wages as a complete loss. Nothing to be gained for. It's a complete loss. If you extend it even a little bit further out, 4 to 6 months, you might see that investing in those workers within that 3-month period resulted in far less turnover within a 6-month period. It resulted in those workers upselling liquor and other things you're trying to sell in the business. Resulted in more consumers coming in because they're seeing the same faces in the restaurant. You know, I call it the Cheers effect. Some of us are old enough to remember a show on television called Cheers, where the motto was, everybody knows your name. It was a show about a bar where there were these workers that had been there forever, and there were customers that had been there forever, and they all were very close friends. They knew each other. Everybody knows your name. That cannot happen when there's 300% turnover, which our industry experiences. 3 turns in one position in 1 year. If you invest in your workers in a 3-month interval, you might see them stay over 4 months, 6 months, a year, in a way that reduces your costs in terms of rehiring, retraining, recruitment, morale, employee theft, employee upselling. If they feel invested in your business as an employee, they're going to do better by you as a customer-facing person. And nobody says this better than Danny Meyer, who's one of the legendary restaurant owners in our industry, started Shake Shack, started the Union Square Hospitality Group, wrote a book called Setting the Table, in which one of the first things he says is that we have to invest in our people, because our people are who sells our food. They're the face of our business. And so if you want the face of your business to be happy and the same, everybody knows your name, and able over time to develop their skill and hone their craft so that you're getting even better food and service every day, then we have to invest in people. It's at this point, I say have to. It's become an imperative, because what we saw post-pandemic was 1.2 million workers walking off the job because they had been disinvested in.
Yes.
And so at this point, if you want people to work in this industry and stay in this industry, there is no choice but to invest in them.
And that's such a great way to kind of segue into the last question, right? Around actions. You know, we have to center workers and we have to invest in people, right? So as listeners, you know, leave this live session today, from the investors who are in our network to civil society advocates, educators, lawyers, they might be wondering, like, how can they support the One Fair Wage movement? So how can they help advance this work, right? And for those who want to learn more, Saru, what's one book or one article or one podcast that you would recommend to our listeners?
Well, if it's okay, I'd actually recommend going to our website, onefairwage.org, and checking out, first of all, the ability for you to send a message to your legislators that you believe that this legacy of slavery has to end and that all workers deserve at least the minimum wage with tips on top. So that's the first thing I would ask of everybody, regardless of their role, that you don't even have to be a citizen to call your legislator and say, I believe that workers, I'm a consumer, I'm a resident, I'm a voter. I believe that my money, my tips should not be going to the boss to cover the minimum wage. They should be going to the worker on top of the minimum wage that the boss pays them. And I think we all can play a role in calling our legislators to make that happen. So that's number one. But the second thing is that as investors and as consumers, you have power to push restaurants to do the right thing. And so we have a list of restaurants that are doing better at highroadrestaurants.org, HIGH roadrestaurants.org. We don't want you just to eat there, because if you only ate there, nothing would change. We want you to take that list on your phone when you eat out at your favorite restaurant, no matter what it is. At the end of the meal, tell the owner, manager, or as an investor, tell somebody you've invested in, I want to see you marked high on this list of great restaurants that's paying a living wage. As a consumer, I want my tip to go on top of the wage, not instead of the wage. I want you to know as a consumer, it's important to me that you pay your workers a full living wage with tips on top. If you do, I can make sure you get really high marks in this app so that consumers know that you're doing that. So I think as consumers and as investors, we can communicate to employers that it's a high priority for us to see them pay a livable wage to workers with tips on top. And the third thing I would say is to educate everybody you know that this exists, because I think most people don't even know that there's a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And on that website, you'll find links to my various books. One Fair Wage is my latest book, but also Forked are books that you can spread among people to get them to actually learn the truth about the history of this issue and its impacts on all of us.
Well, thank you so much, Saru, for joining us today and for being a really key partner in our ongoing efforts to carry forward Bobby and Ethel's legacy of creating a more just and peaceful world. And, you know, as you said, let's push restaurants to do the right thing. Let's center workers and let's invest in our people. So thank you, everyone who tuned in. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter, Charting the Course, for future insights from our investors and our partners. Wishing you all a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.